Hi, I am Scott Savage, and I am the author of several middle grade series, including the Far World Fantasy series, Case File 13 middle grade horror series, and the Mysteries of Cove Steampunk Dragon series. And I'm here today to talk to you about a book that I am probably more excited about than I've ever been excited about a book that I've written. And it is called The Lost Wonderland Diaries, and it comes out September 8th. And I think one of the reasons that this book is so exciting for me to write is that Alice in Wonderland has always been kind of that favorite book for me. As an author, when I'm out visiting schools and talking to kids and getting questions, a lot of the questions you get asked are, how do you come up with story ideas? And how long does it take you to write a book? Well, one of the top questions there is always, what is your favorite book to read? And that's kind of like asking a parent who their favorite kid is. Like, even if you know who it might be, you're still totally not going to say who it is. And that's how I feel about books. There are so many genres that I love. There are so many wonderful books. But if you really push me, the one book that I have always loved, the book that for me is, how you have that one book that you can remember exactly where you were when you read it and what you were doing. Well, for me, that is Alice in Wonderland. We were staying at a friend's cabin, and I was probably about 10 at the time, and I was out on this balcony, and there were pine trees, and I was eating green apples, and I was reading Alice in Wonderland. And I loved that book, and still to this day, eating green apples takes me back to reading Alice in Wonderland. And I think that one of the reasons that I am so intrigued, and one of the reasons why that story has always stayed with me is because of the author himself, Lewis Carroll. So a lot of people know that Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland Diaries. And some people know that that was a pen name that he used, that his real name was Charles Dodson. So you have these two, what appear to be very different people. You have Charles Dodson, the mathematician, college math professor, published multiple books on complex math, was really involved in math theory at the time and debating and arguing different mathematical theories. He was an inventor. He invented different codes. He invented something called the nyctograph, which he used to write at night without burning candles, very similar to Braille, where he had specific codes that he would put in these little squares. He invented what we call word ladders, where you have to change one word to another word, only moving one letter at a time. He invented an early version of Scrabble. Just very brilliant mathematician, inventor, Charles Dodson over here. And on the other side, we have Lewis Carroll, the writer, the wordsmith, the person who created this world that I think, other than Shakespeare and the Bible, Alice in Wonderland's books have been quoted more than any other work of literature. He had words that he created, that he invented for these stories and these poems that seem like nonsense at first, that have now become words that we use all the time, like chortled and burbled and mimsy, galumphing, the snipe, going on snipe hunts. That all came from Lewis Carroll, the imaginator. And for me, I think that combination just has always intrigued me. Even before I knew as much about Lewis Carroll, you saw it in the works that he wrote and what he did there. And honestly, one of the biggest challenges in writing the Lost Wonderland Diaries was trying to capture the feel of his world. And it wasn't like I was trying to do Lewis Carroll. I wasn't trying to read something where you'll say, oh, this is a Lewis Carroll book. But if you're going to write in the world of Alice in Wonderland, at least in my opinion, it needs to have that same magical, whimsical wordplay type feel to it. And so as I'd write pages, my wife, who's my first reader and editor, she'd read these pages and she'd go, this doesn't read like you're writing. And I'm like, is that a good thing? And she goes, no, it's really intriguing. Like, it's a different author writing this. And then at one point she came back and she said, I think I figured it out. She said, I think that this book is your love letter to Lewis Carroll. And I realized that I think that's exactly right, that these stories have been stories that have affected me since I was very young. And so to have the opportunity to write in that world was both challenging but an incredible opportunity. I think the second thing about what intrigued me in these stories is that we see Lewis Carroll, the person, reflected in his stories, because so much of Alice in Wonderland is this logic versus imagination. And a lot of people don't recognize that right away. A lot of people just look at the whimsy of Alice in Wonderland and go, this is silly and it doesn't make sense. But the more you drill down into Alice in Wonderland and Lewis Carroll and what he was doing, the more you discover how much logic there is underneath his stories. Political satire, math, logic, puzzles, and things like that. And that was the second thing that really pulled me in. And so when I was writing the Lost Wonderland Diaries, not only did I feel like I had to capture the way that Lewis Carroll wrote, but I also felt like I had to capture his message of looking at things in a new way and imagining them in a new way. So early on, we have two characters, and I'll tell you more about those characters as we get a little further into the story. But one is a very logical person. Celia is based in science and logic, and Tyrus is our book nerd. He's into imagination and stories and that sort of thing. And so when they first come into Wonderland, they fall into this purple sea called the Arithma Sea. And it's filled with these swimming, what they think are fish at first, but ultimately they realize that they're numbers that look like fish swimming around. And we have these numbers that are forming these math equations. And we have this crocodile down below who's hoping they answer them wrong so that they'll get sent down so he can eat them. And he's talking to them in verse. And at first, we have our logical character who's solving the math problems because she loves math and science, and she's figuring them out. But at a certain point, we get to a problem that can't be solved with straight math. And so here's suddenly Celia, who's stuck, and Tyrus, who's our imagination person, is the one who figures out that she has to turn him upside down so that he can look at the problem in a new way in order to solve it. And that's the second thing that I really loved about Alice in Wonderland, was figuring out what was going on and what was happening and how it was set up. And I think that one of the things that we face right now in our current world is very similar to that. We have this pandemic and we have science that's telling us this is dangerous. You can't go out. You have to isolate. You have to do these things. Well, I know not all kids are the same, but I think one thing that a lot of kids really value and really helps them is having a schedule, is having kind of a consistency to their lives. And what we've done is we've gone, and right in the middle of the school year, we changed that consistency. We said everything that you are used to and everything that you knew is going to change, and you can't go see your friends and you can't go out. And so we suddenly have this really high stress level, which is logical and scientific, but it's hard for kids to handle. So how do kids handle, and how do we as parents and teachers and librarians, how do we help them? I think one of the ways that we do that is through stories and through imagination. I can't tell you how many kids I've had coming and asking us if we have books that they can read because their library's out of them. Or I'm reading online about parents who are connecting with their kids, reading stories again. And I know that for me personally, I got picked on a lot. I did not fit in with most kids. I went through speech therapy. I had a lot of things that were happening in my life that made me not fit in. And the place where I found that was libraries. And I think that in the same way that stories help me, we can now help kids in the same way, that we've got puzzles to solve with logic and imagination, and that we can do it with these stories. So basically, the Lost Wonderland Diaries started with the idea of me thinking how cool it would be to have a couple of kids go back to Wonderland. There are a lot of what you think of as Alice in Wonderland spin-offs, you know, Steampunk Alice and Alice on Drugs and you know, Adult Alice and Wars and all this kind of thing. But you don't see as many middle grade stories. And to me, Alice in Wonderland really was one of the first true middle grade stories. So there was that idea. Well, that combined when I researched Lewis Carroll more and discovered that he kept diaries his entire life. But after he died, 4 of his diaries disappeared. And it was like, oh, wow. Well, what if you had these missing diaries? Like, what if mathematician Lewis Carroll was researching alternate worlds and how to travel from one dimension to another, and he opened a doorway and actually went to Wonderland? And what if that was in the missing diaries? And what if you had these kids who discovered those diaries, and you have the mathematician girl who figures out the math of what was going on, and the boy with the imagination, and between the two of them, they inadvertently open a doorway to Wonderland, and they discover that Wonderland is a real but very dangerous place, that something has changed in Wonderland, and that what used to be slightly dangerous feeling but more fun and whimsical has now become dangerous. And in the 150 years since Charles Dodson was there, something has happened, and creatures are being turned into monsters. So we have all the characters we know and love. We have the Cheshire Cat, but the Cheshire Cat now has a robotic body because his fading in and out was actually because he was disappearing. And so we now have the Cheshire Cat, but a very different Cheshire Cat. Then we have the White Rabbit, and it's the White Rabbit, but not the White Rabbit we know and love, because instead of this little funny creature who's hopping around with his stopwatch, we have this kind of terrifying creature, rabbit, who is fascinated by clocks and time, and has become really quite dangerous. And Marianne is now this marionette who's in his creepy garden and everything like that. So our characters have to figure out what they're going to do with Wonderland. Now, one of the great things, again, and there's just so many wonderful things about Alice in Wonderland, but one of the great things about it is that Lewis Carroll was one of the first people to have an empowered girl as the main character in a story. So here we have Alice, who's not with a mentor or a narrator. She is the one who's going out on this adventure. And this was like 60 years before women got the vote. So what an incredible twist to the story to have this empowered girl telling the story, and just how she reacts to things that happen. Like, it's this crazy world that we'd be going, what is going on here? And there's all these questions, and who are you, and what are you doing, and you're getting bigger and you're smaller, and people are mistaking you. But Alice manages to navigate this in such a fun and unique way. And I've always loved to kind of like change the tropes with my characters. So when I wrote Mysteries of Cove, one of the things that I had noticed in middle grade is that we tend to have a boy who goes out on the adventure. Like, he's the one who doesn't really think it all through. He's impetuous and adventurous, and he goes out and does this thing. And the girl, if there's a girl in the story, is often the bookish one who has studied everything and have all the knowledge, and she's much more cautious. So when I wrote the Mysteries of Cove series, my girl was the adventurous one. She was the one who's like, hey, I'm climbing up this fence and you can come if you want to or not. So when I wrote Alice in Wonderland, I knew that I wanted to have 2 characters, because again, what we're looking at is the conflict in our world, ideally conflicting and creating situations with the conflicts in our characters. I knew right away that I wanted my character to have dyslexia. It fit the story and what I was doing. And usually the character who has dyslexia in stories is a boy. Well, in this case, Celia is our dyslexic person, and her mother is a librarian, which is really bad for her because she hates reading. And when she comes to this new town where she's moving in, she's going to be going to a new school, all she wants to do is fit into the school. That's all she cares about. She doesn't want to stand out. She doesn't want to succeed. She just wants to be not picked on. In fact, she spends a lot of her time playing Minecraft on her phone because it makes her not have to interact with anyone. There's not a lot of words to it. She can be involved in this world, and she doesn't have to be seen in her world. Well, the other character who she meets, ironically enough, in a library is Tyrus. And Tyrus is the consummate book nerd. In fact, if you look at him right here, he's got a big backpack that he's wearing. He's got this giant backpack on his back, and he wears it everywhere. And inside his backpack are all these books. And at first, Celia thinks that he's stealing books from the library because she sees him taking these books off the return cart. And then once she actually gets to know him, she discovers that what he's really doing is he's reshelving the books. Like, he just loves putting books where they go, and he loves books. And because he's not an employee, he's not supposed to do that. So he sneaks them off the cart, and he keeps this backpack full of books because he has all these stories. But he also has an issue, and that is that he has used books a lot like I did when I was a kid to kind of hide from problems in the world and being picked on. And libraries are the one place that he feels safe. So we have these two very unlikely characters who discover Lewis Carroll's diaries, open this world, go into it. And now the conflict that we have is we have Celia, who's like, okay, this is all wrong. Like this is, there are roads that twist on back on itself, and weird signs and creatures that talk, and everything's different here. And we just need to find a way to get back home. And then there's Tyrus, who is all about figuring out what is wrong with Wonderland and saving Wonderland. And so between the two of them, they have to solve these puzzles. They have to balance logic and imagination. They have to figure out what's going on with Wonderland. And ultimately, they have to decide if they are going to save this world. And Celia's going, Tyrus, this isn't a story anymore. We could really get killed here. And he's going, yeah, but this is the coolest place ever. How are we going to save Wonderland? I mean, what an incredible opportunity that we have. And I really hope that as people read these stories, whether it inspires kids to go read the original Alice in Wonderland stories, whether it inspires them to write their own stories, or maybe right now, again, in this kind of unsettled time, it lets them see both the logic and the imagination and find a way to balance that in their world and to solve the puzzles that are really their lives right now. And that's, as an author, that's all you want. Like the best thing in the world is having a kid come up to you and go, I read your book, and here is how it changed my life. And that's all you can ask for. So anyhow, I hope you like it. I'm so excited to share it with you. You can order review copies if you're seeing this right now before it comes out. You can order review copies as librarians, as teachers, as reviewers, as influencers on both netgalley.com. You can go in there and request it, or on Edelweiss. And again, if you know either one of those sites, if you don't, you can Google them. You can get e-arcs to read in advance, and let me know what you think, and I would love to hear your feedback, and I hope that ultimately you get to share them with your kids, and that they're as excited about the stories as I was about the original Alice in Wonderland stories. So thank you very much.